The morning sun was just beginning to warm the busy streets of Manhattan when Donald Trump's black limousine came to an unexpected stop. It was 8:30 a.m., and the former president was running late for an important business meeting. The traffic ahead had completely stopped due to construction work, something his security team hadn't planned for. Trump sat in the back of his luxury car, looking at his phone with mild frustration. He wasn't used to delays, especially on his carefully planned schedule. As he glanced up from his screen to ask his driver about alternative routes, something caught his eye through the tinted window. There, on the sidewalk near Central Park, an elderly man was carefully arranging books on a piece of cardboard. What made Trump look twice wasn't the unusual sight of a sidewalk library, but rather the familiar military patch on the man's worn-out jacket. It was the same insignia his uncle had once proudly shown him years ago. The homeless man worked with careful attention, despite his obvious physical struggles. His hands shook slightly as he arranged each book, but there was pride in his movements. He treated each worn paperback as if it were a precious treasure, carefully dusting off their covers with his sleeve before placing them in neat rows. "Stop the car," Trump said suddenly, surprising his security team. The lead security officer, Mike Davidson, turned around with concern on his face. "Sir, we're already running 20 minutes late for your meeting," Davidson reminded him. "And this area hasn't been secured for an unscheduled stop." But Trump wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were fixed on the old veteran's jacket, which, despite its worn and tattered state, was clearly well cared for. The military patches were still firmly attached, and even from the car, Trump could see they had been carefully sewn back on multiple times. "I said stop the car," Trump repeated, this time with the tone his staff knew meant there would be no discussion. The security team exchanged worried glances but followed his order. As the limousine pulled to the curb, people on the street began to notice. In New York, Trump's car was easily recognizable, and soon phones were coming out of pockets and purses, ready to record whatever was about to happen. The homeless man, however, remained focused on his books, unaware of the commotion building around him. Before his security team could fully exit their vehicles, Trump was already opening his door. Davidson rushed to his side, speaking urgently into his radio to coordinate with other team members. The crowd growing on the sidewalk created a security nightmare, but Trump seemed oblivious to their concerns. "Sir, please," Davidson pleaded, "at least let us secure the area first." Trump adjusted his red tie and straightened his suit jacket. "Sometimes, Mike," he said, "you have to trust your instincts. Look at his jacket. That's a 7th Infantry Division patch. My Uncle John served with them." The homeless man still hadn't looked up from his work. He was now carefully writing something in a small notebook, probably keeping track of his little library's inventory. His weathered hands moved slowly but deliberately across the page, each movement showing years of military discipline despite his current circumstances. As Trump approached, the crowd grew larger. Business people stopped their morning rush to work, tourists paused their photos of Central Park, and street vendors left their carts unattended, all drawn to this unusual scene unfolding on a Manhattan sidewalk. The morning sun caught the American flag pin on Trump's lapel as he stepped closer to the makeshift library. The homeless man's collection was impressive, nearly 50 books arranged by size and type. There were worn military history books, classic novels, and even a few modern bestsellers, all apparently free for anyone to borrow. Trump's security formed a protective circle around him, but he waved them back slightly. He wanted to approach the veteran without intimidating him. As he got closer, he could read some of the book titles: The Art of War, Band of Brothers, Catch-22, and several books about military engineering that reminded him of conversations with his Uncle John. The veteran finally looked up when Trump's shadow fell across his carefully arranged books. His eyes widened with recognition, but he didn't show the usual excitement or nervousness people displayed when meeting Trump. Instead, he carefully closed his notebook, placed it beside his books, and slowly stood up, his military training evident in his posture despite his age and condition. No one in the growing crowd could have guessed what would happen next, as two men from completely different worlds prepared to have a conversation that would change both their lives forever. The veteran's name was James Peterson, though everyone on the streets knew him simply as Jimmy. As he stood face to face with Donald Trump, his weathered features showed no sign of being starstruck. Instead, there was a quiet dignity in his stance that came from years of military service. Sir, Jimmy said, naturally falling back into his military manner of address. His voice was clear and steady, surprising many in the crowd who had walked past him for months without ever hearing him speak. Would you like to borrow a book? Trump smiled, genuinely caught off guard by the simple offer. Tell me about your service first, he replied, pointing to the familiar patch on Jimmy's jacket. That's the 7th Infantry Division, isn't it? Jimmy's eyes lit up at the recognition. Yes, sir. Served from 1968 to 1975. Started as a combat engineer. Ended up working on some classified projects at Fort Hamilton. He paused, then added with a hint of pride, they called us the Hourglass Division. Trump's interest grew visibly. Fort Hamilton. My uncle John Trump worked there as a civilian contractor in the early 70s. He was involved in some engineering projects. Dr. John Trump? Jimmy's voice carried a note of excitement now. The MIT professor? I remember him well, sir. He helped design some of our specialized equipment. Brilliant man, always took time to explain things to us soldiers. The crowd around them had grown larger, but the two men seemed to be in their own world. Trump's security team maintained their protective circle, while news reporters who had caught wind of the situation began arriving at the scene. Jimmy slowly sat back down, his legs clearly bothering him, and Trump, to everyone's surprise, took a seat on a nearby concrete planter. The former president's expensive suit was a sharp contrast to Jimmy's worn clothes, but in that moment, they were just two men sharing memories. What happened after the service? Trump asked, his tone softer than his usual public speaking voice. Jimmy's eyes briefly clouded over. Had a good life for a while, sir. Used my GI Bill to study engineering at community college. Met my Sarah while working at an electronics firm in New Jersey. We had 20 wonderful years together. He paused, running his hand over a worn photo album among his books. Then Sarah got sick. Cancer. Insurance covered most of it, but there were experimental treatments we wanted to try. Spent everything we had. Sold our house, our car, but we lost her anyway. The morning sun had risen higher now, and more people were gathering around them. Some in the crowd was quietly wiping tears from their eyes. After Sarah, Jimmy continued, things just fell apart. The medical bills kept coming. Missed some work during her illness. Lost my job. Then the VA benefits got tangled up in some computer system update. Been trying to straighten that out for 3 years now. Trump leaned forward, his expression serious. But you kept your books, he observed, gesturing to the carefully arranged collection. A small smile crossed Jimmy's face. Books saved my life, sir. When I first ended up on the street, I was in a dark place. Then I found this copy of The Art of War in a dumpster. Started reading it again, reminded me of my military days. Gave me purpose. He gestured to his makeshift library. Now I lend these out to anyone who needs them. Other veterans, homeless folks, students, doesn't matter. Knowledge should be shared. Got about 200 regular borrowers now. Keep track of everything in this notebook. Jimmy opened his worn notebook, showing neat columns of names, dates, and book titles. His handwriting was precise and military clean, each entry carefully documented. It was clear that even without a roof over his head, he had maintained the discipline and organization from his service days. Some of these people, Jimmy said softly, they just need someone to believe in them, to trust them with something valuable. These books aren't just stories, they're a way to show people they still matter. Trump was silent for a moment, studying the man before him. In Jimmy's careful organization of his small library, in his dedication to helping others even when he had almost nothing himself, there was something that touched him deeply. It wasn't just the connection to his uncle or the military service. It was the unbreakable spirit of a man who refused to lose his dignity or his desire to help others, even when the world had turned its back on him. What Trump did next would not only change Jimmy's life, but would start a chain reaction that nobody could have predicted. What happened next surprised everyone, especially Trump's security team. After listening to Jimmy's story, Trump stood up and straightened his suit. The crowd expected him to say goodbye and return to his car. Instead, he turned to Mike Davidson, his head of security. Cancel my morning meetings, Trump said firmly. The crowd murmured in surprise. Davidson stepped closer, speaking in a low voice. Sir, you have the real estate meeting at 9:30, and then the interview with. Cancel them all, Trump interrupted. He wasn't using his public speaking voice or his business voice. This was different, quieter, but more determined. Something more important just came up. The security team exchanged worried glances. This wasn't in their protocol. The area wasn't secured, there were too many people with phones recording everything, and their carefully planned schedule was falling apart. But Trump had already turned back to Jimmy. "Show me how your library system works," Trump said, sitting back down next to the veteran's cardboard shelves. The expensive fabric of his suit gathered dust from the sidewalk, but he didn't seem to notice. Jimmy's eyes widened slightly, but his military training helped him hide his surprise. He opened his worn notebook and began explaining his simple but effective tracking system. Each book had a small number written in pencil on the last page. This number matched his notebook entries, where he kept track of who borrowed each book and when. "See here," Jimmy pointed to a page filled with neat handwriting. "Maria borrowed To Kill a Mockingbird last Tuesday. She's a high school student who can't afford her own books. And here, Tom has basic engineering principles. He's trying to learn enough to apply for a maintenance job." As Jimmy talked, Trump's expression changed. The usual mask he wore for television cameras and public appearances slipped away. He was genuinely interested in this homeless veteran's makeshift library and the people it helped. Suddenly, a young woman pushed through the crowd. She was wearing a coffee shop uniform and holding a book. "Jimmy," she called out, then stopped short when she saw who was sitting with him. Jimmy smiled warmly. "Sarah," he said, and everyone noticed how his voice softened when he said his late wife's name. "This is one of my regular readers." The young woman, whose name tag reads Sarah, seemed nervous but determined. She held out the book she was carrying. "I finished The Great Gatsby," she said. "It was amazing, just like you said it would be." Trump watched as Jimmy carefully took the book, checked its condition, and made a neat mark in his notebook. The whole process took less than a minute, but it was done with the precision of a military operation. "Would you like to try it of Mice and Men next?" Jimmy asked her. "I think you'd enjoy Steinbeck's writing style." As Sarah nodded eagerly, Trump pulled out his phone. But instead of checking his messages or making a call, he opened the camera and started taking pictures of Jimmy's notebook. His security team tensed up. Trump rarely took his own photos. "Sir," Davidson started to protest, but Trump waved him off. "Mike," Trump said, "what we're looking at here is better organized than half the businesses I've seen. This man is running a free library from the sidewalk, keeping perfect records, and helping people improve their lives. And he's doing it all while the system that promised to help him is failing him." The crowd had grown even larger now. News vans were pulling up at the end of the street. Reporters were pushing through the crowd, shouting questions. But Trump wasn't paying attention to them. Instead, he was calling someone on his phone. "John?" "Yes, I know what time it is. Listen, I need you to get me everything you can on VA benefits processing. And call Bill at the plaza. Tell them I need a room prepared immediately. No, not a regular room. One of the good ones." Jimmy started to protest, but Trump held up his hand. "You're not sleeping on this sidewalk another night," he said firmly. "Not while I can do something about it. And not while you're doing more good for the city than most of the politicians running it." The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the sidewalk library. As Trump continued making calls, nobody in the growing crowd could have guessed how this unusual scene would transform not just Jimmy's life, but the lives of thousands of veterans across America. As the morning turned into early afternoon, Trump and Jimmy sat at a quiet table in the Plaza Hotel's restaurant. The veteran's worn clothes stood in sharp contrast to the luxury around him, but he held himself with such natural dignity that none of the other diners dared to stare for long. "Tell me more about those classified projects at Fort Hamilton," Trump said, after their coffee arrived. The restaurant had been quickly cleared of other guests, with only security personnel and a few trusted staff remaining. "My Uncle John mentioned something about specialized engineering equipment." Jimmy's eyes lit up with recognition. "We were working on advanced radar systems," he explained, carefully holding his coffee cup with slightly shaking hands. "Your uncle, Dr. Trump, he had this way of making complex things simple. He'd spend hours teaching us soldiers the basic principles behind the technology." Trump leaned forward, genuinely interested. "That sounds exactly like Uncle John. He always said that if you couldn't explain something simply, you didn't understand it well enough yourself." "That's it exactly," Jimmy exclaimed, then quickly lowered his voice, remembering where he was. We had this project. I can talk about it now. It's been declassified, where we were developing portable radar units for field operations. Dr. Trump would sit with us during lunch breaks, drawing diagrams on napkins, explaining how everything worked. As Jimmy spoke, Trump noticed how the veteran's whole demeanor changed. The years seemed to fall away from him as he described the technical details of their work. His hands stopped shaking as he used them to sketch invisible diagrams in the air, explaining wave frequencies and signal processing. "You really know your stuff," Trump said, impressed. "How did someone with your skills end up on the streets?" Jimmy's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. Life has a way of throwing unexpected curves, sir. After Sarah's medical bills, I tried finding engineering work again, but technology had changed so much. Companies wanted younger people with newer skills. Then, when the VA benefits got tangled up, he shrugged, the military man's way of accepting what couldn't be changed. Trump pulled out his phone and showed Jimmy something on the screen. "Look at this," he said. "While you were telling me about the radar systems, my team was doing some checking. Your benefits paperwork has been stuck in something called a processing loop for 3 years. It's not just you. There are thousands of veterans caught in the same problem." Jimmy nodded sadly. "Many of my readers are veterans in the same situation. That's why I keep extra copies of the VA Benefits Guidebook in my library. But the system is so complicated now." Trump's expression hardened. "It shouldn't be complicated. These paper pushers have turned a simple promise, taking care of our veterans, into a maze of red tape. But here's something interesting." He scrolled through his phone. "Your old security clearance was never properly deactivated. Technically, you still have active status." Jimmy sat up straighter, his military training showing through. "That's impossible. It should have expired years ago." "Sometimes bureaucratic mistakes work in our favor," Trump said with a slight smile, "and this particular mistake means you're still officially listed as active personnel. My lawyers say that changes everything about how your case should have been handled." He placed his phone on the table, screen up, showing an email from his legal team. "According to this, you should have been fast-tracked through an entirely different system. The benefits you were entitled to, Jimmy, they're substantial, including full medical coverage, housing allowance, and back pay for the missed years." Jimmy stared at the phone, then looked up at Trump with eyes that had seen too much hardship to easily trust good news. "Sir, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but—" "No buts," Trump interrupted firmly. "This isn't charity. This is fixing a mistake. The government made a promise to you, and they broke it. I'm just making them keep their word." He gestured around the luxurious restaurant. "You know what I see when I look at you, Jimmy? I see someone who lost everything except his dignity and his desire to help others. You could have sold those books, could have given up on helping people. Instead, you built something meaningful out of nothing. That's the kind of person this country can't afford to waste." Jimmy sat in silence for a moment, processing everything. Outside the restaurant's windows, news vans were still arriving, and photographers were trying to get photos through the glass. But in that quiet moment between the two men, something important was happening. A chain of events was being set in motion that would reach far beyond one homeless veteran's life. The next few hours moved quickly as Trump's team sprang into action. The luxurious hotel suite they had prepared for Jimmy remained empty for now. The veteran had insisted on going back to his sidewalk library first. He needed to make sure his regular readers knew where to find him. "They depend on these books," Jimmy explained as Trump's limousine pulled up to his usual spot. Some of his regular readers were already waiting there, looking confused by the morning's events. News crews had gathered too, their cameras following every movement. Trump watched with growing respect as Jimmy spoke to each person individually. The veteran took time to explain that he would be moving his library to a better location, writing down phone numbers, and making sure everyone knew how to reach him. Each conversation ended with a handshake or, for some of his youngest readers, a grandfatherly pat on the shoulder. Meanwhile, Trump was on his phone again. "Yes, I want the whole legal team on this," he said firmly to someone on the other end. "Get me everything you can find about other veterans caught in the same processing loop. I want numbers, dates, locations, everything." His next call was even more direct. "Bob, yes, I know you're in a meeting. This is more important. I need you to look into property options near the VA office." Something with good street access, plenty of space. No, not for me. I'm starting something new. As Trump made his calls, his personal assistant was coordinating with the hotel staff. They would carefully pack and transport Jimmy's entire book collection to his suite, making sure each volume was properly cataloged according to his system. Trump had specifically ordered that nothing should be thrown away or replaced without Jimmy's permission. Even the worn cardboard shelves would be preserved. Sarah, the young coffee shop worker from earlier, approached Jimmy with tears in her eyes. "Will we still be able to borrow books?" she asked quietly. Jimmy's face softened. "Of course, child. In fact, it's going to be even better. Keep coming to this spot for now. I'll make sure someone is here to tell everyone where to find the new library." Trump overheard this conversation and walked over. "Jimmy," he said, "I've been thinking about your library system. How would you feel about expanding it?" The veteran looked puzzled. "Expanding, sir?" "My team found something interesting while looking into your case," Trump explained. "There are thousands of veterans in similar situations across the country. Many of them have skills and knowledge that could help others, just like you've been doing with your books." He pulled up a document on his phone and showed it to Jimmy. "This is the initial proposal. We'll start with a proper building right here in Manhattan, a place where veterans can come to read, learn, and get help with their benefits. We'll hire legal staff specifically trained in VA issues." Jimmy studied the document carefully, his engineering mind taking in the details. "This would help a lot of people," he said slowly, "but it would need someone to run it, someone who understands both the veterans and the books." Trump smiled. "That's exactly what I was thinking. You've been running a library on a sidewalk with nothing but a notebook and dedication. Imagine what you could do with real resources." The news crews were moving closer, trying to catch their conversation. Trump's security team kept them at a respectful distance, but their cameras were rolling, capturing this unusual scene. "Sir," Jimmy said, "is military bearing returning? I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to." "Stop right there," Trump interrupted. "You maintained a top-secret security clearance, managed complex engineering projects, and ran a perfectly organized library system while living on the streets. You're more qualified than half the people running government programs." He gestured to the gathered crowd of readers. "These people trust you. They know you care about them. That's not something you can learn in a fancy school or buy with money. That's something you earn." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, Jimmy looked at his small collection of books, then at the hopeful faces of his readers. He thought about all the other veterans out there, struggling with the same problems he had faced. Finally, he turned back to Trump and straightened his shoulders. "When do we start?" he asked. Trump's answer would set in motion changes that would ripple through the veteran community across America, though none of them knew it yet. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Trump's legal team worked around the clock, diving deep into the complex web of VA regulations and benefits. What they discovered was both shocking and infuriating. Jimmy's case wasn't unique. Thousands of veterans were stuck in the same bureaucratic maze. In his suite at the Plaza Hotel, Jimmy sat at a large desk provided by the hotel staff. His old notebook lay open beside a new laptop, and he was carefully transferring his library records into a simple database that Trump's tech team had created for him. He insisted on entering each record himself, double-checking every entry just as he had done on the streets. "Mr. Peterson," a young lawyer from Trump's team said, entering the room with a stack of papers, "we found something interesting about your benefits case." Jimmy looked up from his work. Even in new clothes, which Trump had insisted on but kept simple at Jimmy's request, he maintained his military posture. "What did you find?" The lawyer laid out several documents on the desk. "Your original paperwork was actually approved back in 2019. The problem wasn't a rejection. It was a computer error that kept cycling your application through the system. Nobody ever actually reviewed it properly." Jimmy studied the papers carefully. Years of engineering work had taught him to understand complex systems, and he could see the point where his file had gotten stuck in an endless loop. How many other veterans might be caught in the same trap? He asked. "That's what Mr. Trump wanted to know too," the lawyer replied. "We're looking into it now. Initial estimates suggest hundreds, maybe thousands." Meanwhile, in Trump's office across town, another meeting was taking place. Trump sat at his desk, surrounded by real estate plans and legal documents. Mike Davidson, his head of security, stood nearby with several other team members. The building near the VA office is perfect, Trump was saying, pointing to a blueprint. Ground floor access, plenty of space for the library and computer stations. We can have the legal help center on the second floor. Sir, one of his advisors interjected, the press is starting to ask questions. They want to know why you're suddenly so interested in veteran affairs. Trump looked out his office window at the Manhattan skyline. You know what Jimmy told me yesterday, he said. He said that when he was working with my Uncle John, they never worried about who got credit for solving a problem. They just focused on fixing things. He turned back to his team. This isn't about publicity. This is about doing what's right. Jimmy spent years helping others when he had nothing himself. Now it's our turn to help. Back at the plaza, Jimmy was meeting with Sarah, the young coffee shop worker, and several other regular readers from his sidewalk library. They sat in the hotel's elegant conference room, which had been turned into a temporary library planning center. The new location will have proper shelves, Jimmy explained, showing them the building plans. But we'll keep the same borrowing system. Everyone who wants to read gets to read. No questions asked. Sarah looked at the plans with shining eyes. Will you still have the engineering books? She asked. My brother wants to study for his maintenance exam. Jimmy smiled. We're going to have even more books, and computers for people to use for job searches and online courses. But most importantly, he paused, making sure they understood, it will still be our library, a place where everyone is welcome. As evening fell, Trump made one final call for the day. Everything set with the contractors, he asked someone on the other end. Good. I want construction started by next week, and make sure they understand. This is just the first one. Once we get the model working here in Manhattan, we're going to build these centers across the country. He walked to his office window again, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, other veterans were sleeping on streets, struggling with the same broken system that had failed Jimmy. But things were about to change. In his hotel suite, Jimmy finished entering the last of his book records into the computer. He looked at his old notebook, thinking about all the lives that had been touched by his simple sidewalk library. Soon, that small act of kindness would grow into something much bigger than he had ever imagined. Neither man could have guessed how their chance meeting would spark a movement that would change thousands of lives. But as the city settled into night, the wheels were already in motion. Word spread quickly through the veteran community. At first, it traveled through quiet conversations in VA hospital waiting rooms and homeless shelters. Then social media picked up the story, sharing pictures of Jimmy's sidewalk library and Trump's unexpected involvement. Soon, major news networks were covering the developing situation. 1 week after their first meeting, Jimmy stood beside Trump in front of the building that would become the first Veterans Resource Center. Construction crews were already at work inside, but the sidewalk out front had been transformed into something special, a recreation of Jimmy's original street library. This is where it all started, Trump explained to the gathered reporters. One man who had almost nothing, sharing books with anyone who wanted to learn. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. Jimmy, now dressed in a simple but clean suit, stepped forward to address the crowd. His voice was quiet but clear, carrying the authority of someone who had lived through hard times and emerged stronger. When I was on these streets, he said, people would walk past me like I was invisible, but the ones who stopped to borrow a book, they saw me as a person. They shared their stories with me, and I learned that there are thousands of veterans out there facing the same struggles I did. As he spoke, a group of familiar faces appeared at the edge of the crowd. Sarah from the coffee shop was there, along with many of Jimmy's regular readers. They held up some of his old books, the ones they had borrowed and returned so faithfully during his time on the streets. The story was catching attention in Washington, too. Several senators had called Trump's office, asking about the computer error that had trapped so many veterans in the benefits system. Trump's legal team had compiled a report that was now circulating through government offices, forcing people to pay attention to a problem they had ignored for years. Mr. Trump, a reporter called out, is this just a one-time publicity event? Trump's expression hardened slightly. Let me be very clear about this, he said. What happened to Jimmy and thousands of other veterans is a national disgrace. This center is just the beginning. We're already looking at locations in 10 other cities. He gestured to the building behind him. Inside this building, we'll have a library twice the size of Jimmy's street collection. We'll have computers where veterans can search for jobs and connect with their families. Legal experts who understand the VA system will be here to help cut through the red tape. But most importantly, he turned to Jimmy with genuine respect in his eyes. We're the people who care. As the press conference continued, something unexpected happened. A middle-aged man in a worn military jacket pushed through the crowd. His hands were shaking as he approached Jimmy. "I saw you on the news," the man said quietly. "I've been stuck in the VA system for 2 years. Nobody would help me understand what was wrong with my paperwork. I've been living in my car." Jimmy immediately stepped away from the microphones, putting a steadying hand on the man's shoulder. The reporters fell silent, their cameras capturing this unplanned moment. "What's your name, brother?" Jimmy asked. "David Martinez, former Army Corps of Engineers." Jimmy turned to one of Trump's legal team members, who was already pulling out a notepad. Then he looked back at David. "You're not alone anymore," he said firmly. "Let's get you some help." Trump watched this interaction with growing conviction that they were doing the right thing. He had built towers and golf courses, but this project felt different. This wasn't about making money or gaining publicity. This was about fixing a broken system that had failed the people who had sacrificed everything for their country. As the sun began to set on that important day, more veterans were arriving at the building site. Some came in old military jackets, others in worn civilian clothes. Each one had a story similar to Jimmy's, of service, sacrifice, and a system that had let them down. Jimmy greeted each one personally, just as he had done on his street corner. But now, instead of just offering them a book, he could offer them real hope for change. The ripple effect of that chance morning meeting was growing into a wave that would soon sweep across the country. 3 months after that fateful morning, when Trump's limousine stopped near Central Park, the first Veterans Resource Center was ready for its grand opening. The building had been transformed from an empty shell into a warm, welcoming space that somehow captured the spirit of Jimmy's sidewalk library while offering so much more. Jimmy stood in front of the entrance, adjusting his new tie nervously. He was wearing a suit that Trump had insisted on buying him, though he had chosen the simplest one possible. His military badges, carefully transferred from his old jacket, gleamed on his lapel. "Are you ready?" Trump asked, walking up beside him. Jimmy nodded, looking at the growing crowd. There were news cameras and reporters, of course, but what really caught his attention were the familiar faces, his regular readers from the streets, now mixed with hundreds of veterans who had heard about the center. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was simple but meaningful. Instead of using fancy golden scissors, Jimmy used the same old pair he had used to carefully repair damaged books on the street. As the ribbon fell, the doors opened to reveal what Trump and his team had created based on Jimmy's vision. The first floor housed an expanded version of Jimmy's library. The old cardboard shelves had been carefully preserved and mounted on the wall as artwork, while new wooden shelves held thousands of books. Jimmy's original collection had its own special section, the worn volumes now protected in clear cases but still available for reading. "Look at this," Sarah, the coffee shop worker, said excitedly to her brother as they entered. She pointed to a new computer area. "Free internet access and online courses. You can study for your maintenance exam right here." The second floor was dedicated to veteran services. Trump's legal team had set up permanent offices there, specifically focused on helping veterans navigate the benefits system. The wall displayed a large counter showing the number of veterans they had already helped, starting with Jimmy himself and growing every day. David Martinez, the veteran who had approached Jimmy at the construction site 3 months ago, was now working at the center's front desk. He had been the first person Jimmy hired after getting his own situation sorted out. "Welcome home," he greeted each veteran who walked through the doors. During the opening ceremony, Trump took the podium to make an announcement that surprised everyone, even his own team. "Today, we're not just opening one center," he said. "I'm pleased to announce that construction has already begun on similar centers in 15 other cities. But more importantly, we've identified and fixed the computer error that trapped so many veterans in the system. Over 10,000 cases have already been resolved." He turned to Jimmy. None of this would have happened if this man hadn't decided to share his books with strangers when he had nothing else to give. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. Jimmy stepped up to the podium next. His voice was still quiet, but it carried clearly through the room. "When I was on the streets," He said, "These books were my way of staying human, of remembering that I had something to offer. Now, thanks to Mr. Trump and his team, we can offer so much more." He gestured to the crowd. "This isn't just a building. It's a promise to every veteran who's feeling lost or forgotten. You're not alone. You matter. And we're here to help." As the day went on, more and more veterans came through the doors. Each one had a story, and each one found something they needed, whether it was legal help, a quiet place to read, or simply the company of others who understood their struggles. Late that evening, after most of the crowd had gone home, Jimmy sat in his new office. Through the window, he could see his old spot on the sidewalk where it all began. On his desk sat his old notebook, now retired but kept as a reminder of where he'd come from. Trump stopped by on his way out. "How does it feel?" he asked. Jimmy smiled, thinking of all the lives that would be changed by this place. "It feels like coming home," he said. "And like we're just getting started." As night fell over Manhattan, the lights of the Veterans Resource Center stayed on, a beacon of hope for anyone who needed it. The chance meeting of two men from different worlds had sparked a movement that would continue to grow, proving that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can lead to the most remarkable changes.